Hello again, and thanks for joining us for Monday's edition of Alaska Weather on this 9th day of January, now 2023. Up first, hazardous weather graphic showing a kind of orange area there on the eastern Arctic coast, Kaktovik, Barter Island. That's a winter storm watch that goes into effect Tuesday afternoon and continues through Wednesday night, and that's for possible blizzard conditions due to winds gusting to 50 miles per hour that'll create whiteout conditions at times, possibly just a watch now, not a warning yet. And again, that's out Tuesday afternoon through Wednesday night. And then to the west there, under Prudhoe Bay, that's that portion of the coastline there shaded. That's a winter weather advisory for the same time frame, Tuesday afternoon through Wednesday night. And that's due to, well, that's out due to winds that are expected to gust to 45 miles an hour, and that'll reduce visibilities in blowing snow to a half mile at times, or maybe even less. And from there, that's it for the warnings, watches, and advisories around the state. So right to satellite imagery, and you can see starting out in the west there, that low center continuing to pull off to the northwest into Russia there, and then that frontal boundary really weakening now west of the Pribilofs, north of the Aleutian, so not really a factor at all in any of the weather forecasts. And then low pressure tracking northwestward south of Kodiak Island, and that first band of moisture is what brought the light snow across south central Alaska overnight last night, and since moved westward there with some clearing coming in from the west. Looks like some clearing, definitely clearing along the North Gulf Coast into the portions of the Copper River Basin, as well as the Kenai Peninsula and northern Cook Inlet area. And there was some light rain, Kodiak Island today, and some light precipitation over the Alaska Peninsula areas as well. And otherwise, no big storms, kind of upper high pressure over the eastern North Gulf Coast and over the Panhandle today, making for dry conditions there with a fair amount of clearing down to the south and some breaks all the way up even to the north there, with some clouds just sitting over western Dixon entrance. And then the next band to the south of the Queen Charlotte's north of Vancouver Island, that'll be coming northward later on. Otherwise, on the chart today, that trough swinging through that brought the snow across south central Alaska, now into the southwest interior with areas of light snow going on there. And gusty northeast winds anywhere from 35 miles an hour at Bethel, 35 to 40 miles an hour at Kipnook, and gusts to 55 miles an hour at Cape Romanzoff. That creating some blowing snow conditions there with visibilities down to half mile at times in some locations. Otherwise, just lingering snow showers over the western Alaska range, and an area of snow, that trough, kind of a little bit narrower band than what I'm showing. It's mostly south of the Yukon River, but areas of light snow extending from southwest to northeast there into the Yukon Flats, and some areas of light snow also for the North Slope and out to the Arctic coast, especially on the eastern Arctic coast, seeing some light snow throughout the day, as well as from Point Lay down to about Cape Lisburne there. Out to the west, again, washing out front, bringing some rain and snow showers from roughly Atka eastward, but not quite to Nikolsky, and more in the way of snow showers over the western Aleutians, with that trough swinging in from the west and northwest, and the colder air there. Of course, snowfall levels down to sea level in that area. Dry over the Panhandle with variable clouds. Same thing over the Copper River Basin today, and also the central interior had some clear skies around Tanana, and back out toward the Seward Peninsula. And looking at the forecast for tonight, areas of light snow continue along that trough axis from the Kuskokwim Bay area northeastward into the Yukon Flats, with gusty northeast winds continuing over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. Strongest along the coast. There are some blowing and drifting snow going on, but nothing too serious. And winds stay light for the Arctic coast and North Slope tonight, with low clouds, fog, and a few flurries around. And in between the troughs, some breaks. Copper River Basin Basin into the eastern North Gulf Coast. Just a risk of some moisture there for the Prince William Sound area and the North Gulf Coast. A little bit better chance on the south side of the Kenai Peninsula. Periods of light rain or snow, depending on your elevation, for Kodiak Island, with winds coming down. Not too bad there. And again, that trough with the 990 millibar low south of the Queen Charlottes will swing up a chance of rain or snow showers into the southern southeast coast. Just a chance there, and that's about it. Just some clouds over the central panhandle, mostly clear, Lynn Canal Glacier Bay, with north and northeast winds, keeping the clouds down to the south there in those areas. Snow showers or rain and snow showers for all of the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula. Most likely form of snow showers for the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutian areas, as well as the Pribilofs. Could see a little bit of light snow at times, but no significant accumulations expected there. Temperatures staying in the upper 20s, or at least in the 20s. And for the outlook for Tuesday, tomorrow, low pressure moves to just south of Togiak Bay, and a trough extending northward produces a widespread area of snow from Bristol Bay. Could see several inches there. It'll extend up across Norton Sound, the Seward Peninsula. Lighter amounts in toward the Kotzebue Sound area and along the northwest coast where it ends. Tightening gradient along the western Brooks Range and along mountains could create some blowing snow through the passes of the mountains up there, as well as the western Arctic coast. And gradient starts to tighten up along the eastern Arctic coast with the wind weather advisories, and winter storm watch goes into effect tomorrow afternoon there, with that trough just south of the eastern Brooks Range. Otherwise, scattered rain and snow showers over the southeast coast possible, a little bit more moisture, and that's mostly going to be over the central and south coastal areas. Just seeing an increase in the clouds elsewhere. Chance of rain and snow showers for the North Gulf Coast on down to Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula, snow showers, scattered snow showers eastern Aleutians, snow showers for the central Aleutians, and dry high pressure ridging over the far western Aleutians. That in advance of that next big storm. It's going to bring storm and gale force winds into the western Aleutians late Tuesday night, and that front will push gale force winds, 45-knot winds in the forecast for the marine areas of Adak and Atka for the afternoon hours, and rain and snow associated with that. Otherwise, high pressure, light winds in advance of that system over the eastern Aleutians of the Pribilofs, so some clearing. Also along the southwest coast, winds are pretty light over the western interior. A little gusty up there over the western Arctic coast, and again over the eastern Arctic coast as well, but drier conditions over the eastern half of the state than what you'll see in the west, with that trough keeping areas of light snow from the Brooks Range all the way down into Bristol Bay. And again, troughs moving mostly west to east, just graze the North Gulf Coast with a chance of moisture, maybe some scattered snow showers over the inland areas of south central Alaska, as well as the Panhandle. And moving on to low temperatures for tonight over the southeast coast, lower 20s there over the northern Panhandle, down to about Juneau, mid-20s Wrangell and Petersburg, lower 30s elsewhere, Sitka about 34, 10 to 15 below in the Copper River Basin, and 0 to 15 below for the Kuskokwim Valley. Lows in the 20s for Bristol Bay, lower 30s Kodiak Island, single numbers south central Alaska, 20s down toward the coast of the Kenai Peninsula, and then highs tomorrow in the mid-30s for the south coast of the Kenai Peninsula, about 10 to 15 below for the highs there in the Copper River Basin, mid-20s down toward Prince William Sound, and 0 to 20 for the Kuskokwim Valley, 30 to 35 for Bristol Bay for the highs, as well as around Yakutat. Panhandle, central and southern areas rising into the lower 40s, but staying below below freezing, well, 0 Celsius, but staying below freezing from Juneau on up toward Haines and Skagway. And for the lows on Wednesday morning, again, 10 to 20 below in the Copper River Basin, 5 below to 15 above in the Kuskokwim Valley. Teens, a little milder now over south central Alaska, 20s for the Kenai Peninsula, mid-20s Kodiak Island, down to upper teens, northern Panhandle, to lower to mid-30s to the south and southwest, mid-20s Kodiak Island. Highs Wednesday afternoon, still below 0 in the Copper River Basin, 20s to mid-30s Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, and upper 20s to lower 30s for south central Alaska, mid-40s Prince of Wales Island to near freezing up toward Haines and Skagway. Over the interior, lows 5 to 20 below tonight, all the way out to the Seward Peninsula, followed by highs 0 to 10 above, except below 0 over the North Slope and Arctic coast, followed by lows a little milder on Wednesday morning. 5 above to 10 or 15 below, coldest in the North Slope and the Arctic coast, followed by highs 5 to 15 in the east and 0 to 5 in the east, and in the teens to the west, at a little below 0 for the North Slope and the Arctic coast, and out to the southwest, lows in the lower 20s for the Pribilofs and lower 30s for the eastern Aleutians, upper 20s to lower 30s for the Alaska Peninsula and the central and western Aleutians, followed by highs in the upper 20s for the Pribilofs, lower to mid 30s for the Aleutians, mid to upper 30s for the Alaska Peninsula, lows down below 20 for the Pribilofs, mid 20s for the central Aleutian areas.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather for Tuesday morning. Marginal VFR from the Brooks Range out across the Arctic coast to the Arctic Ocean. And some IFR there at Togiak Bay and most of Bristol Bay into Dillingham and up the southwest coast, a ways across Nunivak Island, and then on down to the north shore of Unalaska Island, covering the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island into Kamishak Bay, as well as the south coast of the Kenai Peninsula, western Prince William Sound, and then a lot of low clouds and fog possible over the inside waters of the Panhandle. So IFR there to start, but as we go into the afternoon, that burns off, and some lingering marginal VFR along the central and south coast, Prince Wales Island area. Otherwise, IFR for the Southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak, Kachemak Bay, across the Barren Islands, on up into Resurrection Bay, and western Prince William Sound there, Passage Canal, Whittier, Portage area. But good VFR, most of the Copper River Basin, and down to the eastern North Gulf Coast, as well as the central eastern interior, and marginal VFR now for the North Slope and Arctic coast, VFR for the Brooks Range, and IFR there, Norton Sound, Norton Bay, down along the southwest coast, all the way to possibly Port Hayden area. And for the Pribilofs, marginal VFR there, as well as the central Aleutians, areas of VFR over the southern Bering Sea. And for the afternoon, or for Wednesday morning, marginal VFR for the Arctic coast. Otherwise, pretty good in the central eastern interior, most of the Copper River Basin, VFR. Marginal VFR into the Panhandle with IFR off the coast. But that'll extend up to the southern Kenai Peninsula and also southern Cook Inlet to the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range. Swath of IFR there from the Chukchi Sea across the Seward Peninsula, southwest interior into Bristol Bay. Marginal VFR for the Bering Sea, especially the eastern Bering Sea. Some good VFR, though, for Adak and Atka, and then the next zone of IFR you can see out to the west there pushes eastward into the central Aleutians by Wednesday afternoon and extends back to Shimian Attu. With the drier conditions, good VFR pushing into the Fox Islands, Pribilos, northern Bering Sea, Nunivak, St. Lawrence Island, looking really good for Wednesday afternoon. And the eastern interior, as well as the North Slope, eastern Brooks Range, VFR, IFR for the North Gulf Coast. And for passes, Anatuvik, VFR for the day Tuesday, Adigan, same forecast, north and south entrance through the pass, VFR, Lake Clark and Merrill, marginal VFR, either approach at times, and for rainy, occasional marginal VFR throughout the day Tuesday, and windy, it'll be VFR. Isabel, starting out marginal, becoming VFR throughout the day, and Mentasta, looks like it'll be VFR. Sanita, marginal VFR. Portage, IFR, especially on the eastern entrance. And Chilkoot and White, looking good with VFR flying for both passes. Freezing levels at the surface there, well south of the Pribilofs, but north of the Aleutians, except out toward Shimian Attu. and then cutting up across the North Gulf Coast through Bristol Bay there and across the northern panhandle, 2,000 feet up to about Middleton Island, almost up to Yakutat, but covering most of the panhandle. And from there, taking a look at icing, could be some isolated moderate rime icing there for the central and south coast of the panhandle, pushing eastward a little bit there, but mostly remaining along and off the coast. And also another area with southeast flow there up to the southern Kenai Peninsula into Prince William Sound, southern Cook Inlet, and the eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range. And then some areas of possible isolated moderate rime icing there along the lower Yukon River Delta area, Norton Sound, as well as Togiak Bay, possibly into the southern Kuskokwim Mountains, but pretty good elsewhere. And for the jet stream, southerly flow through the central interior at about 60 knots, and then 135 knot west-northwesterlies pressing up toward the western Aleutians. And at 9,000 feet, south to southeast winds 40 to 45 knots, strongest right across the Kenai Peninsula tomorrow, and light elsewhere. Then at 3,000 feet, easterlies a band there through the central interior along the Yukon River at 40 to 45 knots, east 60 knots there for the western Arctic coast. And turbulence-wise, some considerable moderate turbulence, Prince of Wales Island and Turnagain Arm, the Madanuska Valley, and the western Alaska Brooks Range.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
The Space Weather Prediction Center has had a long-standing relationship with the power industry, so they've been aware that solar storms, the geomagnetic storm piece of that, can affect the operation of systems and induce extra currents and loads on those systems that can either trip those systems offline or in the worst of cases, cause damage. That relationship goes back for several decades. In fact, a big incident in 1989 where part of Quebec was tripped offline that affected something like 6 million customers for about 9 hours. I think that really raised the awareness in the power industries.
When we get the alert, we watch the grid and start looking for issues. Are we seeing a decline in voltage? Are we seeing equipment failures? And we readjust the system to try to mitigate those problems, try to keep the lights on and keep it from going out.
We're averaging about 500, 550 kilometers per second.
If we didn't have this early warning, we wouldn't see it until our sensor saw it. Getting more information quicker and faster before the storm hits, not during the storm, is a big improvement.
In the long term, I think what we need and what we're moving toward, the U.S. as a whole, is better modeling, fully understanding this phenomenon, understanding how it would impact specific systems.
Rather than actually experiencing a storm, we can simulate storms in our software and see what the impact is. We try to get ahead of it. We always plan that if there's an outage, how can we keep the lights on? What's the best process to prevent it?
In the end, 5-10 years from now, there's going to be a whole mix of operational procedures driven by what we do on prediction and warning. And then there also will probably be some level of hardware controls to ensure the reliability of the grid.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
There's different types of impacts on communication systems, and the HF we call the high frequency, which is that band of communications 3 to 30 megahertz. But it's a very important band of radio communication because it's used widespread. It's used, for example, by the airlines.
HF radio is most commonly used for position reporting when you're going across the ocean airspace, which is devoid of radar, and ATC can't see you, so it's up to you to report your position and your altitude and your speed.
HF works great most of the time, except during a big flare. And during a big flare, that HF communication capability could be gone within a minute or two. So as soon as we see something happening in there or we see a flare, it's one of the first things we do is alert the aviation community, hey, big flare, HF's going to be impacted.
Once we know that there's an event going on, then the aviation industry and the airlines can react to that. They can alter their routes over the poles. They can lower the altitudes that they're flying at, or maybe decide not to fly at all in the interest of their passenger safety.
So that's just one example of how HF is used, but the emergency response community will use it a lot too. It's one of their primary backups.
When you've lost connectivity between certain government agencies, it gives you that long-range coverage to talk from out of state to federal governments or from the FEMA locations to the state emergency operations centers.
So if you've got a big hurricane impact in the coastline, whatever big city, we've got the cell towers down and whatnot, we've got emergency communication folks in there. Those folks are very familiar with space weather and how it impacts their systems.
Here in recent years, it was used during Katrina when we had a lot of communications outages down there. It was also used during Hurricane Ike. There was an outage of the telephone circuits with the Texas State Emergency Office, so it was used in both those situations.
So when we talk about backup, especially for the airlines, typically they'll have SATCOM, so that'll be satellite communication.
The satellite technology that emergency responders use could be GPSs, could be satellite phones, satellite data terminals.
Space weather events can impact SATCOMs. The impact can range from a nuisance to loss of a spacecraft. So we will give them the heads up. If we have space weather events, flares, whatnot, they need to know what's impacting their systems. Situational awareness is key. Time is of essence to these folks. Again, it's life and death.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to marine forecasts. For Tuesday, east winds 30 knots on the south coast of the Panhandle. East and northeast winds 15 to 25 knots on the north coast. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, north winds 25 knots, 4 to 5 foot seas. Southeast 20 knots for Clarence Strait. And for the day on Wednesday, shaping up like this, east-southeast winds 30 knots for the south coast, east 20 to 25 knots on the north coast. Small craft advisories continue for the inside waters. For Clarence Strait, southeast at 25 knots, Stevens Passage northeast at 25, and north winds continue for Lynn Canal at 25 knots. And for the North Gulf Coast, Tuesday, east winds 25 knots. Prince William Sound, mostly northeast winds at 15 knots with 3-foot seas. Cook Inlet looking at northeast winds 20 to 30 knots, strongest south of the Forelands. And northeast winds at 30 knots for Kamishak Bay. Barren Islands, east winds 25 knots, seas around 10 feet. And for Wednesday, for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 10 to 20 knots, seas down to 3 to 5 feet in the ice-free waters. Northeast winds 15 knots for Kamishak Bay, North Gulf Coast, and the Barren Islands, all east winds at 15 knots with seas at 8 feet, and a light northeast breeze at 10 knots for Prince William Sound. Kodiak Island for Tuesday, south to southeast winds 10 to 15 knots. The Alaska Peninsula, north to southwest winds at 10 to 15 knots. Small craft advisories for Bristol Bay for southeast winds running 25 knots. Seas at about 4 feet. They'll swing around to the north and drop off to 10 knots for Bristol Bay on Wednesday. And for the peninsula, north to northwest winds at about 15 knots. Kodiak Island, variable winds at 10 to 15 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 15 to 20 knots. Adak and Atka looking at northwest winds at 20 to 25 knots, and northwest 30 knot winds for Amchitka Island, and for the western Aleutians, west winds at 25 knots. And then Wednesday, with that next big storm and frontal system coming up, we've got gales and storm force winds with the storm warnings out of the east at 50 knots from Kiska Island to Shemya, and then 45 knot southeast winds for Amchitka Island, Adak, and Atka. Gale warnings for Unalaska, or for Unimak Island, for south to southeast winds at 40 knots. Otherwise, west winds 25 knots for Unalaska Island. For the southwest coast on Tuesday, north winds 20 to 25 knots, north winds at about 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands, and northeast winds 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. St. Lawrence Island, north winds 30 knots. And then for Wednesday, for the Pribilofs, northeast winds 20 knots, same thing for St. Matthew Island. The southwest coast, looking at a light northwest wind at 10 to 15 knots. Brisk wind advisories for St. Lawrence Island, north winds 25 knots, and Norton Sound, winds will be east at 20 knots. Up to the north along the central and eastern Arctic coast, looking at northeast winds Tuesday at 20 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the western Arctic coast, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots, and north winds 30 knots from Wales to Cape Thompson. And for the Chukchi Sea on Wednesday, northeast winds 25 knots. Gale warnings for the western Arctic coast, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Gale warnings also for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for east winds 35 to 40 knots. And the central Arctic coast, winds will be out of the northeast at roughly 30 knots. And looking at tonight's weather again, look for some areas of light snow, low clouds, possible fog for the Arctic coast and portions of the North Slope. Otherwise, not too bad through the Brooks Range. An area of snow along a trough in the interior there extends out to the southwest coast. And chance of rain or snow showers continue for the western North Gulf coast. Stays dry with an increasing chance of some light showers maybe over the extreme southern panhandle. And then for the day on Tuesday, still some no change up to the north there, with less snow over the central interior areas as it shifts westward. And snow showers pretty widespread over the southern Bering Sea and the Aleutians, with drying conditions ahead of that next big storm coming into the far western Aleutians we'll see on Wednesday. That brings storm and gale force winds north and eastward to the Atka Island area. High pressure for light winds over the Pribilofs and eastern Aleutians. Chance of snow anywhere over the western interior diminishes over the east side, and a chance of rain and snow showers continues for the North Gulf.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.